Hi, everybody who's watching this. For our viewers, I'm Kristina Rex from WBZ, here with Jennifer Roman, our legal analyst, who is helping us with legal analysis for our coverage of the Lindsay Clancy trial. I'm just going to do a little recap in case you're watching this for the first time. Lindsay Clancy is a mother from Duxbury who is currently charged with first-degree murder for the murder of her 3 children from January of 2023. Lindsay Clancy's defense actually doesn't dispute the fact that she strangled her 3 children with exercise bands and then attempted to take her own life afterwards. So the trial began this week. Well, the trial technically began last week with jury selection, but witness testimony began this week. It's been a very heavy week, and Jennifer and I are going to basically break it down and talk about it a little bit. And we'll be doing this every Friday throughout the trial just to kind of do a little recap at the end of every week. So thanks, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Let's start big picture. The prosecution's putting on its case right now, 4 days into testimony because there was one day off this week. And the jury has gone home for the day already at the point I'm talking to you. They have heard from Lindsay Clancy's ex-husband and the father of the children, as well as a myriad of first responders and a few medical providers who treated the children at the hospital. What, in your opinion, legal expert, what is the jury going home with at the end of this week as the prosecution makes its case? What do they know, and what does the prosecution want them to be thinking at this point?
Sure. The jury is definitely leaving, I think, with the heavy impact and weight of Patrick Clancy's testimony. And his testimony kind of went both ways, right? I mean, there's no dispute that Lindsay Clancy did this. That has never been the question, as you noted. It's really a question of what her mental state was in January of 2023 when she killed her children. And Patrick Clancy did a lot for the defense, actually, on his direct with prosecution. He was really laying groundwork about how much Lindsay had been struggling with her mental health, that she was severely depressed, that they were concerned about her potentially taking her own life, that she had expressed having intrusive thoughts and thoughts of harming herself and the children, although she had not expressed any specific intent or ways that she might go about doing either of those things. That is all very helpful to the defense. We also have Patrick Clancy saying that she was so sufficiently upset, distraught, not functioning well that he told her she had to go to McLean's hospital for that 4 or 5 day hospitalization to try to figure out what was going on. So that was all really helpful, I think, to the defense and didn't come out quite the way that the prosecution wanted it to. I also think, on the other hand, though, the prosecution did a good job saying, well, Patrick Clancy, you didn't know if she was complying with her medication regimen. You don't know what she was telling her providers. You were sort of relying on what she was telling you. And so you don't really know what was happening. I thought that was a really valid point for the prosecution to make. I think that the prosecution also did a good job of suggesting that Lindsay Clancy might have been a little cavalier about her mental health, that she took a selfie of herself in McLean's hospital, suggesting that maybe she wasn't really taking this as seriously as she could. At the end of the day, those two winning points for them, though, are not going to help them get over the damaging testimony, I think, that already came out from Patrick Clancy.
Because isn't the whole point here, from the prosecution's point, that they allege that even if Lindsay Clancy had mental health issues, that she was in her right mind when this happened, right?
Yeah. Yes, the prosecution is focusing on elements of control over her functioning, her executive functioning, to show that she was within her right mind. She understood right from wrong. She appreciated the wrongfulness of her conduct, and she premeditated this, right? So they did do a good job on those areas of getting out what the days leading into the days of the killing looked like. Patrick Clancy helped them out big time on that one by saying she was the best I'd seen her in a while. Things seemed really like they were back to normal. Things felt good. When she asked me to go pick up the Miralax for Cora and to pick up takeout, he almost seemed like he was feeling uplifted and optimistic. And they made it clear he didn't have concerns about leaving her alone with the children. He wasn't concerned that she was going to do something to herself or to the children. Very helpful to the prosecution. They were also showing through through our third-party witnesses, the CVS manager, the restaurant hostess who took their takeout order, that Lindsay Clancy was engaging in conversation, answering appropriately, did not sound like she was out of it or impaired in any way. And so the prosecution's really trying to show she had clarity of mind. And she knew what she was doing. She was within control of herself. Very helpful points to the prosecution. Is it going to be enough, though, when we have all of that other mental health background coming into play? That sort of remains the big question. And I think it's really going to turn on what the experts on both sides have to say about the progression of Lindsay Clancy's mental health in her postpartum depression, which defense says led to a postpartum psychosis.
Right, because if defense's claim is that she just snapped that night, out of nowhere, uh, couldn't two things be true in this case? Couldn't it be true that she was coherent at 5 o'clock and not at 5:20? I mean, I do we know?
But you mean, I presume so, yes. I mean, I think, from what we've seen in other cases and what we understand, people can just snap and just have this break. I mean, that is the whole concept of a psychotic break. And that is clearly going to be the defense argument is that she had been struggling just because it wasn't obvious, just because she hadn't taken this opportunity, as the prosecution would say before, to kill her children or to try to harm herself, doesn't mean that in that moment it didn't just snap for her. And so that's going to depend on expert testimony, right? How likely is that happening? What is the nature of postpartum psychosis, if that's in fact what she had? And what's the prosecution going to have to say to sort of rebut that? They're going to lean on the premeditation components that they're trying to prove. They're going to lean on she was having very coherent conversations. She had not expressed a specific intent to hurt or harm herself or the children before this. And are those signs? I'm anticipating an expert is going to say that, before psychotic breaks happen, we typically see XYZ things going on. Were those XYZ things present for Lindsay Clancy? Those are some of the questions the prosecution's going to have to answer to be able to tighten up their prosecution. And then, of course, we're going to hear the exact opposite, most likely from the defense, right? That these things can just happen. It's a break. Nobody can predict it. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the expert testimony starts to unfold and where the tension lies in the respective expert testimony.
Yeah, I do want to know, I asked you for a big picture takeaway of the week and you talked about Patrick Clancy. There have been 17 witnesses on the stand since he wrapped up. And I will say he took 2 full days pretty much. The remaining witnesses were each far shorter, and the large majority of them were first responders at the scene that night. But what's your takeaway from the rest of the witnesses who have testified this week? And not only that, but the order that these witnesses are testifying.
The prosecution's been flying through witnesses. Once they got done with Patrick Clancy, they have been going very quickly. Some of these witnesses have only been on the stand for 5 or 7 minutes. Which is great, right? They're focused on what they need to get from the witnesses. They're keeping it moving. Fantastic. But as a result of that, we're also seeing a stunted trial time because they don't have other witnesses lined up for the afternoon. Could that be because Kevin Reddington is choosing not to cross-examine the majority of these third-party witnesses, and then what cross-examination he has done has been very limited? Certainly the prosecution expected more of cross-examination, which would slow things down a bit. But I think that's a bit frustrating for the jury that the prosecution, who's in control of the pace of this case, isn't ready with a plan B should it go faster than they thought it was going to be. So I think that's sort of one. I think the jurors are probably feeling some frustration. I think I had said earlier that the choice to put Patrick Clancy on first was what I consider to be a bold choice. And I was really expecting more of a grabbing kind of testimony following his testimony. The way that Patrick Clancy's testimony came in, and then the fact that they put on a string of third parties, right? The hostess, the CVS manager, then the first responders from the scene, then the first responders at the hospital. I feel like we lost some momentum. And I feel like the weight and the impact of Patrick Clancy's testimony is sort of diminishing because it's not going to be as temporal for the jurors, right? They said it's the first witness they heard, and there's some logic. I mean, there's this theory, right? We remember the first thing we hear, we remember the last thing we hear, we might remember something in the middle. Maybe that's the theory the prosecution's going on, is that they're going to remember Patrick Clancy and then they're going to finish with some sort of really strong witness at the end that will tie things together for them. But right now, it sort of feels like they've lost some momentum and that the jurors may have even been a little bit bored just hearing from these different first responders over and over again about how they came upon the scene. Lindsay Clancy on the ground, be sort of in and out of consciousness, and then these three children with the exercise bands around their necks. I mean, that was just so chilling. And even some of these first responders who are trained for these kinds of horrific situations were getting choked up talking about what they came upon in that basement. And that was really, I think it's going to stay with the jurors.
That actually brings me to something I wanted to talk to you about. And you and I have spoken about this. And I believe if people have watched our coverage, I've done some stories about this prior to this trial. But something that I feel is kind of glaring over the trial is we've said it multiple times. Lindsay Clancy and her defense attorney don't dispute what happened.
Right.
And so much so that her attorney had offered to stipulate to the fact that she killed her kids in the manner that she did in order to instead make this a trial about mental health. The prosecution did not want to do that, did not agree to that stipulation, and the judge denied the request to kind of split the trial in two. And so
Mm-hmm.
here we are, and we've heard more than a dozen witnesses now testify about either how they found Lindsay, how they found the kids, what the injuries were, which, as we've said, are horrific to listen to. Any resuscitation efforts in the ambulances at the hospital. Um, it, I just, why are we doing this? This is a public trial. We're talking taxpayer dollars, and we have a defendant here who doesn't dispute what she did. So why is this going on in the format that it is?
This is because, remember, the prosecution's theory of first degree murder could be one of two theories. They don't have to say which theory they're pursuing. The first one is premeditation, right? So that's all that timing that they spent a lot of time with Patrick Clancy on. But the second theory that they could be pursuing their first degree murder charge on is the cruelness of the offense and the atrocity of it. And that's where the nature of how they died, that's where the 40 minutes to try to resuscitate the baby comes into play. So they're doing this, I think, to show that even if you don't find she premeditated this, you could still find that she acted with such extreme and cruelness that this was an atrocity that supports a first degree murder charge. But I
Mm.
don't know if the jury appreciates that right now. I don't know if they understand that there's two different theories. Yes, it's been presented to them, and the judge told them at the beginning, these are the basic elements of what the prosecution needs to prove. But that's not, these are lay people. These aren't trial lawyers. And so I think the jury might be sitting here going, why? Kind of, it's like your question. Why? Why are we doing this? And nobody can explain to them why, the way that you and I can explain to your viewers. So I think the jury is kind of scratching their head like, why did we have to sit through all of this? Why is the prosecution making us do this when the defense is clearly not challenging the who did it portion of this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about Lindsay Clancy's reactions. Just what do you make of her? We've seen, I think the pattern I've noticed is that anytime the 911 call, when it was played, we are not allowed to share the actual audio. We're not allowed to play the audio, but there was video and we could see Lindsay Clancy as it was being played. She was heaving, so out loud sobbing by the end of the 911 call. And then other points throughout the trial so far, she's been crying, not just like tissue wiping her eyes, crying, like shoulders shaking, crying when the children's deaths are described. And at the same time, I've noticed that she doesn't look at the screen when the children's pictures are being displayed, even the happy family pictures. She
Yeah.
rarely, if ever, looks up at the screen. What do you make of how she's been behaving?
Well, I think it's important for the jury to see her response. I mean, a lot of this, a lot of the pretrial hearings, she was very sort of stone-faced, showed very little emotion, very little affect. And I did notice as well that during the opening, when the prosecution started talking about how she did it, she seemed to become a bit emotional, not sobbing, but certainly showed some emotion, some resignation, maybe. And so I think that, this is important for the defense that Lindsay Clancy be humanized for the jury. And Kevin Reddington set that up during his opening statement, talking about who Lindsay Clancy is, what kind of person she was, what kinds of things she was interested in. He furthered that with Patrick Clancy, talking about how she was an athlete through her college years. She liked to be physically active. She enjoyed the company of friends. She liked to do these activities with the children. So he's really trying to develop for the jury. She's not this woman sitting here in a wheelchair today who's on trial. She was somebody very different in 2023 and in the years before that. And I want you to see her as a complete and whole person. And so I think them seeing her show emotion and cry is going to have an impact on the jury. And I think it's going to help humanize her for them. At the beginning of this case, there was some discussion where the defense said they didn't know if she'd be able to sit through some of this and had planned on asking the judge to maybe ask her to, allow her to be excused from the courtroom during some of this testimony. And I thought that that could actually be detrimental to them if the jury doesn't see her reacting and having what you would expect to be some type of a response from her. Then that could be damaging to them. At the same time, it could be helpful to the prosecution. We expect somebody, particularly a mother who's taken her children's lives, to feel remorse, to feel bad about that. And so is the jury going to sort of say, well, maybe she really was in her right mind back then. She just chose to plow through anyway and do this. So I think it could kind of lean either way, but I think it's probably going to have more import for the defense that the jury understands who she is as a human being and that she does have emotion. She does feel badly about what she did.
Right, but you're saying that it's kind of hard to know with the jury, seeing her express emotion in the way that you would expect someone to express emotion in response to these horrible details might make the jury think she's normal.
Yeah. It might totally normalize her for the jury. And it also may play right into the defense argument that she didn't have to be psychotic 3 months before the murders. She only needed to have that psychotic break for the 15 minutes that it took her to take her children's lives and then try to cut her neck open and jump out the window, right? The period of time of when she had to be out of her right mind is very limited. And so, so this notion that like she could be these two people, right? So we're talking about, does it have to be an exclusive situation? Could it be both? Is it the same sides of the same coin? That's the defense, that's their theory, is that you can be all of these things at one time. Just you have to look at the moments in time.
Yeah, you and I had spoken about this yesterday, actually, but I want to make sure we bring it up on here. It seems as though part of the prosecution's theory is that Lindsay's suicide attempt was fake is the word we've been using. Maybe that it wasn't a genuine attempt to take her own life. What we've learned in evidence so far is that she took some pills. I don't think we know specifically what they were. Used a kitchen knife to cut her wrists and her neck in a way that the prosecution has described as superficial, and the
Right.
defense has pushed back on that description. And then um, jumped out a second story window, but then also perhaps didn't jump because there's been some evidence about some blood on the side of the house that might imply that it was more of a slide. Sorry, this is so like gruesome, but it's a big part of the testimony. Why do Lindsay Clancy's injuries and the manner in which she got them matter so much for the prosecution?
They matter for a couple of reasons. Um, One is it undercuts this notion of a psychotic break. She says, or we expect that there's going to be testimony that she heard a voice in her head that said, "You have to kill the children before you can kill yourself." And the prosecution is saying this isn't somebody who, she didn't snap. She knew what she was doing. She was in control. She was in control up until the moment that she hit the ground. I mean, again, very gruesome facts, but she knew what she was doing. She planned that she was deliberate, and it's because she was so controlling and so manipulative that she didn't think anyone else could take care of her children the way that she could. And so if she was going to take her own life, she was going to take them with her. That this is part of her selfish, distorted thinking, but selfish, worldview. So this notion that she, and then we also have to think about this not guilty by reason of insanity, like what the elements of that are. And that is that, that the crust of it is, did you have the presence of mind to appreciate the wrongfulness of your conduct? And so what the prosecution is saying, she was so in control that she knew enough to make it look like she wanted to take her own life, when really her sole goal was to kill the children. So they want the wounds on her neck and her wrists to be superficial. That's why they focused on the fact that the gauze around her wrists and her neck, it wasn't bleeding through. It's why they had first responders talk about that. You had one first responder who say that the wounds on her neck appeared to be superficial. The prosecution wants this to be a fake attempt, as we're sort of calling it for lack of a better expression, because then that lends itself to the presence of mind, the control, right? And the ability to regulate oneself, the ability to appreciate right from wrong.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of reasons why they want this suicide to not really be a true attempted suicide.
There's two more points I want to touch with you before we wrap up, both of which are kind of forward looking. One of which is, can you explain the difference for our viewers of Lindsay's plea here? She has not pleaded not guilty, as in there's no scenario where she is a free woman at the end of this trial, right?
Right.
So what are the possible outcomes here?
So it depends on how the jury ultimately comes down. They could find her guilty of first degree murder, either under one of those two theories. They could also find her guilty of a lesser offense that's included in first degree murder, a manslaughter, let's say, sort of a reckless or negligent conduct that was reasonably likely to cause death. Less likely that they're going to find a manslaughter charge given how these murders occurred, right? I think we're really focusing on the murder charge here. Is it a first degree or a second degree murder? So they could find her guilty, boom, done, right? But what they could also find, which is what really the best case for the defense, is not guilty by reason of insanity. I mean, the more technical term is not guilty by reason of a mental illness or defect, but colloquially refer to it as not guilty by reason of insanity. And the outcome of those two verdicts, guilty or a not guilty by reason of insanity, have different penalties at the tail end. So if she's found not guilty by reason of insanity, she will still be committed to the hospital. Because the idea is that you are insane and unable to regulate yourself. You are still a danger to society or to yourself, and you need protection, and the society needs protection from you. So you're not free to just go. You're going to go back to the hospital where she's been. And then it's up to the hospital at some point down the road to determine whether or not she's capable and safe to be released back, into the community. So it's its own jail sentence, it's its own prison. But you have the ability to get out. Whereas if she's found guilty of the murders, because the jurors think that the prosecution did prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she was within her right mind when she did these murders, then she would be looking at a potential prison sentence for life or a hospitalization that she would not have the ability to be released. So if the hospital down the road 5 years from now said, okay, you've been stabilized, you've been sufficiently rehabilitated from a medical standpoint, she would then be turned over to prison where she would serve her sentence for the rest of her life. Because we are looking at life, in
Right.
prison if convicted, if actually found guilty.
So there's still an option here where if Lindsay Clancy is convicted, found guilty, she could go to the same mental facility where she's been committed to for 3 years now and then be transferred to prison once she's better.
Yes, because we have to understand that the prison needs to be able to meet her medical needs. And her needs, as we were sort of surmising, are so acute still. She has nurses sitting in the courtroom with her. She's got 24/7 care that a prison can't facilitate that. They're not a medical facility. They are a prison. So the idea is that she would be confined, but to the hospital. And then if she got to a place where she no longer needed the medical care that the hospital needed to provide to her, she would then simply be transitioned to a prison and serve time. So
That's interesting. Okay, looking forward, we're still in the prosecution's case. We there's an assumption at the courthouse. We don't know for sure who the next witnesses are. There's an assumption that's going to be more medical doctors who treated um, Lindsay because they've already called to the stand the doctors who treated her two sons.
right.
So the doctor who treated her daughter and then also the doctors who treated Lindsay have not testified yet. So there's kind of an assumption that that's the category that's coming up next. What are you looking for? If you're analyzing the prosecution for the sake of the jury, what holes do they need to fill in right now to meet either of those theories of first degree murder that we talked about?
I think you're totally right that the next doctor is most likely going to be the treating physician, Cora. And then we're going to go into who treated Lindsay Clancy. Best case for the prosecution is that the doctor who treated Lindsay Clancy can provide insight into her state of mind at the hospital, right? So far, we've heard she was sedated, she was in and out of consciousness. But if we've got a doctor who's like, no, she was able to answer questions, she was or was not showing remorse or an understanding about what she did, right? She mentioned or did not mention that she was hearing voices. Really for the prosecution, they want to hear didn't say anything about voices, was able to answer questions, did not show any remorse or regret about her children, didn't ask about her children or how they were doing, seemed very focused on herself. If the prosecution can get that out, that is going to be a big boost to their theory of the case and to their prosecution here. If they can't get that kind of testimony out, because that's sort of like the wish list, like that would be a dream for the prosecution if all those points came in. They can't get that, then their second best case scenario is getting some of those points. I think if the doctor can provide any insight about Lindsay's interactions that seemed normal, whatever normal might look like under these circumstances, but if she's able to engage and answer questions about how she's feeling, about level of pain, does she have any numbness? Because we know that she was ultimately paralyzed. I think that's going to help the prosecution, right? Any sort of answering of questions that shows that she's still very much present and understands what's happening around her, understands she's in a hospital room, understands who the doctors are, understands why there's armed officers or why she's handcuffed to the bed. Like, if they can demonstrate that she understood all of that, that's going to be very helpful because we want, as the prosecution, the closer in time, we want to be able to nail down her state of mind. And that, proximity to the murders is going to be really helpful to the prosecution if they can secure that kind of testimony.
Okay, I said I was done, but I have one final question following up on that, which is if the prosecution wants to nail down the, window of time in which Lindsay appeared to be in her right mind, um, when it comes the defense's turn to present its case, how, other than having Lindsay herself say this is what I experienced, are they able to say, no, for those 15 minutes or whatever it was, she was in a psychotic break?
Well, remember, the burden is on the prosecution, not only to
They
prove
don't
that
have
she
to.
did this,
Right.
right, but also, Massachusetts is a minority state in this regard, but the burden is also on the prosecution to show that she was in her right mind.
Hmm.
So the defense, they're already laying this groundwork. She had extensive mental health treatment. She was trying different medications, was having very severe side effects from different medications that she was on, seemed to be spiraling in November, December of 2023. Patrick Clancy said it was a gradual decline, but he definitely saw a decline, and that culminated in him in early January of telling her that she had to go to McLean's, that it was
Hmm.
that serious, that they were seeking a true inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. So the defense is already laying the groundwork for that and has gotten some of that evidence in already just through the limited witnesses that we have had. So this burden's always on the prosecution, and they got to keep hammering that home to convince this jury that she did appreciate the wrongfulness of her conduct on that day.
Right. And so there might never be a moment where someone, either a doctor or Lindsay Clancy, just says, yeah, for that X amount of time, she was in a psychotic break and was out of her mind. Like no pinpointed moment where that might happen in this trial.
No, I don't think anyone can pinpoint that moment exactly. I anticipate the testimony is going to be that this kind of psychosis can be very fluid. It can kind of come in and out. I mean, if you think about, anybody who has Alzheimer's, right? Some days or some hours, they're really clear and coherent, and you're thinking,
Mm.
wow, they don't seem like they're sick at all. And then you know nothing visually happens, but then they don't remember who you are, they don't remember where they are, there are conversations on repeat with you. I suspect
Right.
that the conversation and the testimony around the psychosis and the state of somebody being in psychosis is going to be analogous to somebody with Alzheimer's, that you can kind of come in and out. And so that's why pinning down that moment, that 20-minute window, is going to be really important for both sides. For the prosecution to be able to say, no, she knew what she was doing, and for the defense to
Mhm.
be able to say, she can go in and out. She could have been, she was out of it long enough to do this. And then when she realized, when she came back, that's when she tried to kill herself, right? Because she was
Mhm.
so distraught and overwhelmed by what she had done and the
Right.
significance of it, that the only thing that seemed logical to her at that point was to take her own life.
Jennifer, thank you as always.
You're
Viewers,
welcome.
thank you for watching. If you have any questions that you want to make sure I ask Jennifer when we talk on Fridays at the end of each week, please just let us know and we will make every effort. Thanks.